Picture this. A winter evening in London, 1874. The Ashwell townhouse blazing with gaslight, every window lit against the January dark. 200 guests in silk and broadcloth moving through rooms that Harriet Voss had not set foot in for 6 years. And standing at the top of the main staircase, the Duke of Ashwell, her father's title, her mother's silver, her grandmother's Flemish tapestries behind him, with a woman on his arm who was not his wife. Harriet was not his wife. That was the point. Harriet Voss was, technically speaking, employed by the house. She had been for 3 weeks. She had come through the servants' entrance on a Tuesday in December, given a false name to the housekeeper, and been assigned to the linen cupboards on the upper floor. The work was real. The name was not. And from the linen cupboard on the upper floor, she had a very clear view of the room her mother had died in, the desk where her father had written his letters, and the particular quality of silence that a house holds when it has been taken from someone who loved it. She had not expected to feel so much simply standing in a room. She had expected, after 6 years, to have processed it more efficiently than this. She had been wrong about that. She was wrong about quite a few things that winter. She would come to understand this gradually, in the way you understand things that cost you something. Not all at once. Never all at once. But that is the middle of the story, and the beginning matters. Harriet's father, Sir Edmund Voss, had died in the autumn of 1868. When Harriet was 23 years old and newly married to a man in Edinburgh she had believed, with the particular confidence of someone who has not yet been thoroughly disappointed, to be worth believing in, the marriage had not lasted. Neither, it turned out, had her inheritance. Her father's will had been challenged within a month of his death by a distant cousin, Aldous Grieve, who produced documents Harriet's solicitor described as unusual, and her own instincts told her were something considerably worse than unusual. The legal proceedings had been long, expensive, and ultimately decided against her. She had received a settlement that was technically adequate and practically an insult, packed what remained of her mother's things, and left England. She had spent 6 years in Edinburgh, then Montreal, then Edinburgh again, doing translation work and teaching French to the daughters of people who did not know her name and would not have been interested in it if they did. She had become, through necessity and then by choice, a woman who was very good at being unnoticed. This was the skill that brought her back. The Ashwell townhouse had new staff every few years. She had known this from her father's time. Her father had employed people for decades, had known their children's names, had attended their weddings. But that was her father, and this was not her father's house anymore. The housekeeper, a brisk woman named Mrs. Fenwick, had taken Harriet on without particular scrutiny. She had given her name as Mary Hartley. She had kept her accent flat. She had worn the dark dress and the sensible shoes and the expression of someone who wanted nothing more than to be useful with the linen. She was very good at it. She was there because of a letter. It had reached her in Edinburgh through a circuitous route that involved her solicitor, a man named Mr. Farley, whom she had retained more out of loyalty than any expectation of usefulness, and who had surprised her in November by sending word that something had come to light regarding her father's estate. Not an overturning of the judgment. Nothing so clean. But a discrepancy, he wrote carefully, in the original documentation. A discrepancy that might, with the proper evidence, be brought to a rather different conclusion. What he needed was evidence, the specific kind that existed in houses, in desks, in the study on the second floor that overlooked the garden, where her father had kept his private correspondence, in a cabinet with a lock that Harriet knew how to open because she had watched him open it 1,000 times and had memorized, the way children memorize things without meaning to, the exact sequence of his hands. She had come back for the cabinet. She had not expected the Duke. Julian Ashwell, had inherited the title from an uncle who had purchased the Voss properties during the legal chaos following her father's death. He was 37, recently returned from 4 years in India with the colonial service, and possessed of the particular quality of a man who had been competent in difficult circumstances, and had developed a corresponding directness that people in London drawing rooms found either bracing or alarming, depending on their temperament. Harriet encountered him on her second day in the house, when she was carrying a stack of folded linen down the upper corridor, and he came around the corner with a letter in his hand and nearly walked through her. He caught the linen. He was taller than she had expected from the portrait in the morning room. He had the kind of face that was not conventionally handsome, but was the sort you kept looking at, not because it was pleasant, but because it was legible. He was, she understood in that first moment, a man who looked at things directly. This was inconvenient for her specific purposes. She thanked him. She kept her eyes at the appropriate height. She moved on. He said nothing. She did not look back to see if he watched her go. She did not allow herself to look back. The study was locked. This was new. Her father had not locked the study because her father had trusted his household. Harriet spent 2 days determining the housekeeper's pattern, 2 more memorizing the location of the key, and one night, on a Thursday, when the house was quiet and most of the upper staff had retired, she went in. The cabinet was where it had always been. The lock was unchanged. She opened it in 11 seconds. What she found inside was both more and less than she had hoped for. Less, because the specific correspondence she needed, the letters between her father and his solicitor in the months before the challenge to the will, was not there. More, because what was there, bundled in paper and tucked beneath a set of household ledgers that had not been touched in years, was a collection of letters in a hand she did not recognize, addressed not to her father but to Aldous Grieve, and containing, in language that was careful but not careful enough, references to an arrangement Harriet read 3 times before she fully understood what she was looking at. She replaced everything exactly. She committed to memory what she could. She locked the cabinet and left the study and went back to her room and sat in the dark for a long time. In the morning she was up at 6 and attending to the linen as though nothing had changed. Something had changed entirely. The winter party had been announced in December, a gathering of the Duke's business associates and their wives, 200 guests over 3 days, the kind of event that required a fully staffed house operating at considerable pitch. Mrs. Fenwick had been brisk and efficient about it. Harriet had been assigned to the upper floors, the rooms being made up for guests, the corridors to be kept clear, the fresh linen to be distributed twice daily. She had not anticipated the woman in the blue suite. Her name was Miss Orla Stanhope. She arrived on the first evening with 3 trunks, and the manner of a woman who had been a guest in houses considerably finer than this one, and was doing it the favor of her presence. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired, striking in the specific way that benefits from attention and diminishes slightly without it. She required a great deal of attention. She had a maid of her own, but she also required, apparently, the services of the house, which meant Harriet had occasion to attend to her room twice on the first day and once in the early evening of the second. It was on the second evening, in the upstairs corridor, that Harriet overheard something that was not meant to be overheard. She was not the only one in the corridor. Miss Stanhope was speaking with a woman Harriet didn't know, in the low, rapid tone of women exchanging information they consider significant. Harriet kept moving. She did not stop. She did not appear to listen. She heard Julian. She heard the announcement at dinner tomorrow. She heard, well, he can hardly not after this long, can he? She went downstairs. She folded linen, she thought. The dinner was formal. Harriet was not at the dinner. She was in the corridor outside the dining room with the other upper staff, available if required. Not required until the third course, when one of the footmen came out briefly and said something to Mrs. Fenwick in a low voice. And Mrs. Fenwick's expression shifted by approximately 2 degrees in a direction that was not quite surprise, and was not quite concern, but was something between them. Then there was a sound from inside the dining room, not a dramatic sound. A chair pushed back, footsteps. The door opened, and a woman came out, and the woman was the one Harriet had seen on arrival, Miss Stanhope's traveling companion, a Mrs. Hadlow, who was 40 or thereabouts, and had the expression of someone doing rapid calculations. She did not look at the staff in the corridor. She walked toward the stairs. Then the door opened again, and the Duke came out. He stood in the corridor for a moment. He was holding a glass he had not finished. His face had the particular quality of a man who has just said something in public that cannot be unsaid and is now working out what happens next. He looked at the corridor, at the staff, at Mrs. Fenwick, at nothing in particular. His eyes passed over Harriet. They stopped. She kept her face absolutely still. She had become very good at this. 6 years of being unnoticed had made her nearly invisible when she chose to be, and she chose to be now, and he looked at her for one moment that was slightly longer than a man usually looks at a staff member he has no reason to see. And then he looked away. She breathed. What had happened at dinner? She pieced together over the following hour from fragments of conversation in the servants' hall, from Mrs. Fenwick's careful silence, from the increased pitch of noise in the rooms above. The Duke had made an announcement. The announcement had concerned Miss Stanhope. The announcement had been, by all accounts, somewhat premature, made with rather more confidence than the situation perhaps warranted, and had produced a reaction from Miss Stanhope that nobody was quite describing directly, but that Mrs. Fenwick indicated, with one precise compression of her lips, had been memorable. Miss Stanhope had not thrown anything. That much was established. She had, however, said something that the footmen were reluctant to repeat exactly, but were willing to gesture at in the abstract, and she had said it at a volume that the guests in the room would not forget before the season was out, and the thing she had said concerned not the Duke, but someone the Duke had apparently not considered in making his announcement. His wife. His wife, Harriet learned by 11 o'clock, was in Bath. Had been in Bath for 8 months following a disagreement that the household had been instructed not to discuss, and had therefore discussed extensively in careful low voices. The Duchess, whose name was apparently Adelaide, had left in the spring with her maid and her dog, and had not returned. The Duke had apparently interpreted this as a permanent arrangement, and had proceeded accordingly. Miss Stanhope, it emerged, had interpreted it differently. Harriet sat with this information in her small room on the upper floor, and felt, for the first time since she had arrived in this house, something that was not about the cabinet, or Mr. Farley, or the letters beneath the ledgers. Something older and quieter than any of that. She sat in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, and thought about what it meant to be in a place that had been taken from you, surrounded by people who did not know who you were. She thought about her mother's tapestries in the hall downstairs. She thought about her father's handwriting, which she had not seen in 6 years. She thought about the lock on the cabinet opening in 11 seconds. She picked up her pen. Mr. Farley needed to know what she had found. He needed to know quickly and carefully, through the channel they had established, a letter to a particular address in Gray's Inn, written in the hand she used for correspondence that was not Mary Hartley. She wrote it by the light of a single candle, and sealed it, and put it in the pocket of her working dress to be sent in the morning. Then she went to sleep. There was, she had found, considerable practical benefit to sleeping well. It required discipline, and it was worth it. She had acquired a great deal of discipline these past 6 years. The next 3 days had an altered quality. Miss Stanhope left on the second morning, her 3 trunks departing before 8, with a composure that the household acknowledged privately was impressive under the circumstances. The guests from the dinner managed the situation with the collective social machinery of people who have all, at one time or another, witnessed something awkward in a dining room and know how to redistribute their attention. The Duke went through his professional engagements with the focused efficiency of a man who has decided not to permit personal difficulties to affect his schedule. He was in the house. He was not, as far as Harriet could observe, elsewhere in his mind. He was simply continuing with a quality of determination that she recognized, because she had spent 6 years doing exactly the same thing. She avoided him. This was sensible. She was also curious about him, which was less sensible, and which she attempted to address by being more careful. It was on a Thursday afternoon that she encountered him in the library. She had no reason to be in the library. The library was not the linen cupboard, but there was a window in the library that looked down on the garden in a particular way that no other window in the house replicated, and the garden had been her mother's garden, had contained her mother's roses, which appeared, from the outside, to have been replaced with something more formal and considerably less interesting. And Harriet had simply, for 5 minutes, wanted to look at it. She was allowed 5 minutes. She gave herself very few. He was at the desk when she came in, and she stopped immediately. He looked up. "Mary," he said. It was the first time he had used her name. It struck her as strange. Not the name, which was false, but the use of it, the directness of it, the fact that he had apparently noted and retained what she was called. Employers did this or they didn't. He apparently did. She apologized for the interruption. She indicated the window, a vague gesture, a pretense of some linen-adjacent purpose she did not have. He looked at her for a moment. The view of the garden? Yes, Your Grace, do you like gardens? She had not expected this. My mother kept one, she said, which was true, and which she said before she had properly considered whether to say it. He looked at the window. The roses were changed 2 years ago. The previous arrangement was apparently more elaborate. So I understand, Harriet said carefully. He was quiet. She should have left. She stayed one moment too long because the window was still there and the garden was still there, and in the right angle of the light, if you looked at the corner near the far wall, you could just see where the old rose beds had been, the change in the soil, a memory the ground had kept. You grew up near London, he said. Not a question. She had not told him this. She had not told him anything. She turned her gaze from the window. He was still looking at her. There was something attentive in his expression that she did not like because it was the kind of attention that noticed things, and she had a great many things she would prefer not to be noticed. You know where things are, he said, in the house, which is unusual for someone 3 weeks employed. Harriet felt something cold and specific move through her. She kept her face precisely where she had said it. Mrs. Fenwick keeps a thorough house, she said. He held her gaze a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he looked back at his letter. She left. She did not hurry. She descended 2 flights of stairs at the pace of a woman who has been looking at a window and is now returning to her work, and by the time she reached the linen cupboard she was breathing quite steadily. She was not panicked. She was, however, reviewing her timeline. Mr. Farley replied 6 days later. The reply was brief and very precise, which was characteristic of him, and one of the reasons she trusted him. What he wrote was this: the discrepancy she had identified was consistent with what he had suspected. What he required to make any further progress was not only the letter she had described, but the specific document, a deed of arrangement dated October 1868, which may also be in the house. It would be in the same cabinet or in the estate records held with the solicitor Aldous Grieve had engaged at the time. Both were inaccessible to him. One was accessible to her. She read the letter twice. She folded it. She went to the kitchen and asked for tea. She needed more time in the study. She needed the Duke out of the study. This was the difficulty. The Duke, she had established over 3 weeks of careful observation, worked in the study from 8 in the morning until 1 or 2 in the afternoon. He took lunch either in the dining room if he had guests or at the desk if he didn't. He was in the house most evenings. He had very few social engagements for a man of his position, which Mrs. Fenwick attributed to the recent unpleasantness without specifying what unpleasantness she meant. Harriet had her own view on this. A man who had spent 4 years in India and came home to a title he hadn't expected and a house that wasn't his in any sense that mattered. A house with someone else's roses taken out and someone else's letters in a cabinet he hadn't opened was not, perhaps, a man who wanted a great many dinner parties. She understood this. She did not allow herself to understand it too specifically. It was not useful. What was useful? On Wednesday mornings the Duke went to his club. He was gone from 9 until 2. She had 5 hours. She went in on a Wednesday in January. The study was dim. The fire had been banked. She moved quickly and quietly to the cabinet and opened it in 11 seconds and began very methodically to work through the contents. The deed of arrangement was there. She understood, looking at it, why Mr. Farley had needed her to find it and why it had not been produced during the legal proceedings 6 years ago. It was not precisely forged. It was something more sophisticated than forgery. It was authentic in its paper and its ink, and in the signature of her father, which was her father's actual signature, and it was still a lie because it predated her father's illness by 3 years. And Harriet knew, as she knew her own name, that her father had not been in communication with Aldous Grieve in the autumn of 1865, because in the autumn of 1865 her father had been in Canada with her mother, and she had letters from that trip, 7 of them, dated and postmarked, sitting in a box in Edinburgh. She was holding evidence of something that had been done to her family. She was holding it in her own house, in her own father's cabinet, in the study she had played in as a child. She stood very still. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor. She replaced the document. She shut the cabinet. She moved to the shelves along the near wall and took down a volume at random and was standing with it open, not reading it, when the door opened and the Duke came in. He stopped. She turned. She kept her face composed. He was a full hour earlier than he had ever been on a Wednesday. He was looking at her with an expression that had moved in the space of perhaps 2 seconds through several things and settled on something she couldn't read precisely. "Your Grace," she said, "I beg your pardon. I came to dust the shelves and found myself rather caught by this." She indicated the book. She did not look at what book it was. She hoped it was something credible. He looked at the book. Something shifted in his expression. "That's a history of land surveys in the Ottawa Valley," he said. "Very interesting," Harriet said without inflection. He looked at her. She looked at him. A great deal was happening in that moment that neither of them acknowledged. "You were in Canada," he said. It was not quite a question and not quite a statement. It was the thing a careful person says when they have arrived at a conclusion through a series of observations they have not shared with you. Harriet closed the book. "I lived in Montreal for a time," she said. "The surveys are familiar to me." This was true. It was perhaps the most useful true thing she had said in this house. He was quiet. He went to his desk. He did not tell her to leave. She remained for a moment and then moved toward the door, dusting nothing, carrying the history of the Ottawa Valley land surveys. And he said, without looking up from whatever he had come back for, "Mary." She stopped. "Take the book if you'd like." She looked at him. He was reading something on his desk. He did not look up. "Thank you," she said. She took the book. She went out. She descended to the linen cupboard and sat down on the small chair in the corner and breathed for a while. She was running out of time. The letter she wrote to Mr. Farley that evening was more detailed than her previous ones. She told him what she had found and what she had not been able to remove. She told him what she needed. She told him the position had become complicated in ways that made her continued presence in the house both more urgent and more precarious. He wrote back in 4 days. He had located a second piece of documentation, he said, through independent means. A letter from Aldous Grieve to his own solicitor, written in the spring of 1869. That made explicit reference to the manner in which the arrangement had been secured. It was not, he said, sufficient on its own. But combined with what she had described and with the letters from the Canadian trip, it might be enough. He was writing to a barrister he trusted. What he needed from her was the deed, or a reliable transcription of its contents, dated and witnessed. He needed a witness. She sat with this for some time. Then she went to find the Duke. She did not go to find him, precisely. She went to the library to return the history of land surveys in the Ottawa Valley, which she had in fact read with some interest over the preceding 4 days, because she had been a thorough reader since childhood and had never been able to skim a book without guilt. He was there. He was often there in the late afternoon. She was beginning to understand his movements in the house, the way she had understood her father's, which was a development she had not anticipated and did not examine closely. She returned the book to the shelf. She turned. He was watching her. "You read it," he said. "I did. All of it. It is a thorough survey." He said nothing for a moment. He had a quality she had noticed and kept noticing, the quality of someone who doesn't fill silences, who lets them sit. "You know this house," he said. "Not as a staff member knows a house. You know where the garden used to be." Harriet was quiet. "I've been thinking about that," he said, "for about 3 weeks. She should have been frightened. She was not, quite. She was something else, something with edges, something that had been building since she had opened the cabinet and found the deed and stood in her father's study with evidence of what had been done to her family. She was, she realized, tired of the name Mary Hartley in a way she hadn't permitted herself to notice until this moment. "My name is Harriet Voss," she said. "My father was Sir Edmund Voss. This was his house." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, which surprised her. It was the silence of something settling. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "Not immediately," he said. "I looked at the portrait. There's one in storage in the second-floor box room. I found it in November." A pause. "I've been waiting to see what you'd do." Harriet felt something shift. Some structure she had been maintaining with considerable effort ease slightly, which was alarming because she could not afford it to ease. And I think," he said, "that whatever you came here for, you haven't found it yet, or haven't been able to remove it." She looked at him for a long moment. He was sitting at the library table with the particular stillness of a man who has already done his working out and is now simply being present for the conclusion. She thought about the cabinet. She thought about the deed. She thought about the 7 letters from Canada sitting in a box in Edinburgh. "There is a document," she said, "in my father's study, in the cabinet." She told him. Not everything, not all at once. She was careful and sequential, and she left out the parts that required trust she had not yet assessed him for, but she told him enough. She told him about the deed, about what it looked like, about what she believed it proved. She told him about Mr. Farley and the barrister and what was needed. He listened the way he did everything, directly, without interrupting, without the performance of listening that some people produce when they wanted you to know they were paying attention. He simply paid attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You need a witness to a transcription," he said. "Yes, someone who can attest to having seen the original document in the cabinet of this house, yes." He stood up. "Then let's go to the study," he said. They went to the study. She opened the cabinet in 11 seconds. He watched and said nothing about the 11 seconds. She found the deed. She read it aloud slowly, and he wrote it down in his own hand, every word, and then he read it back to her, and she confirmed it, and he signed the transcription and wrote below his signature the date and the location and a clear statement of what he had witnessed and under what circumstances. He had, she understood, just done something that cost him something. Whatever claim he held on this property through the original purchase, whatever legal standing had been built on the transfer of her father's estate, was now complicated. She did not say this. He knew it. The letters from Canada, he said, when they had replaced the deed and returned to the library. They'll support the timeline. They're in Edinburgh. My solicitor has them now. He nodded. He was thinking. She could see it, the same quality of focused attention he had given to his letters, his accounts, the conversations she had observed him in over 6 weeks. He thought with his whole mind, nothing held back. It was a quality she had seen in very few people. Her father had had it. What do you want? He asked. Not the estate, not the house, he meant. What did she actually want? She had asked herself this many times in Edinburgh, in Montreal, in the small rooms she had occupied while she worked out translations and taught French, and waited for something she could not have named. She had the answer. She had arrived at it slowly, over 6 years, in the way you arrive at things that cost you something. My mother's letters, she said. They should be in this house, in the correspondence my father kept. I want those. A pause. I want the legal judgment set aside and my father's name cleared of the arrangement he allegedly made. Another pause. I want Aldous Grieve to understand that what he did is known. He was quiet for a moment. Not the estate. The estate belongs to you, Harriet said. You purchased it through the process available to you. What you purchased may have had a problem at its source. That's for the courts to determine. But I'm not here for the house. Then why come yourself? He asked. Why not let Farley do it? Because no one else knew where the cabinet was, she said, and because no one else could open it in 11 seconds. Something moved in Hiva's face, not quite the smile it would become, but the beginning of it. No one else, he agreed. They sat in the library for another hour. He asked questions she answered honestly. She asked questions she had not allowed herself to ask anyone in 6 years. About the estate, about what he had found when he arrived, about whether the household had still had the correspondence from the old staff from before the legal proceedings. He answered directly. He had, she realized, been lonely in this house in the particular way of someone who suspects they are somewhere they don't entirely belong and has no one to say this to. She understood this without remarking on it. She had been lonely in many houses. She was expert in it. The winter went on. Mr. Farley came to London in February. He met with the Duke at the Duke's invitation, which was either a considerable complication or a considerable assistance, and turned out to be the latter. He brought the letters from Canada. He brought the letter from Grieve to his solicitor. He brought a barrister named Mr. Peel, who was 60, meticulous, and had the expression of a man who had seen most things, and had opinions about them that he kept largely to himself. Harriet gave notice to Mrs. Fenwick, who received it with the particular quality of a woman who has known for some time that something was occurring, and had chosen not to inquire into it. She thanked Harriet as Mary Hartley for her work. Harriet thanked her in return. They stood in the kitchen corridor with the competent warmth of two women who have worked in the same house and understood each other's job and had never needed to explain themselves. She moved to a room in a nearby street, a proper room, her own name on the register, Harriet Voss. The legal process was not quick. These things are never quick. Mr. Peel had warned them both. This is not a matter of weeks. It is a matter of months, possibly more than a year, and it will require patience and careful documentation, and at least one uncomfortable public proceeding. He said this in a tone that suggested he expected them to be equal to it. They were equal to it. In the meantime, the Duke's wife, Adelaide, came back from Bath. Harriet heard about this through the particular channel that is available to a woman who has spent 6 weeks working in a house and has left it on reasonable terms with everyone in it, which is to say that Mrs. Fenwick's niece, who lived on the street where Harriet now rented a room, mentioned it. Adelaide had come back in March, quietly, with her maid and her dog, in a manner that the household found, according to Mrs. Fenwick's niece, considerably calmer than when she had left. The Duke, it appeared, had written to her in January. The specific contents of the letter were not known. What was known was that she had come back, and they had had a long, private conversation. And the household had been walking carefully for a week afterward, and then things had settled into something that was not quite what it had been before, but was, people felt, somewhat more honest. Harriet, when she heard this, sat with it for a while. She thought about what it took to write a letter like that, what it cost, the specific kind of honesty required to write honestly to someone you had hurt, without the protection of thinking they owed you understanding. She had written letters like that to no one, because there had been no one to write them to, and she understood that this was both simpler and considerably lonelier than the alternative. She was glad for Adelaide. She did not know her. She was glad anyway. In April she was invited to dinner. Not at the Ashwell house. That would have been something else entirely. At a small restaurant in Mayfair, where the Duke had booked a private room and invited Mr. Farley and Mr. Peel, which made it professional, and also Sophia, his wife Adelaide's particular friend, who made it something slightly different, and Adelaide herself, which made it the thing it actually was, a dinner at which people who had been in an unusual situation together were attempting to work out how to be, as ordinary people, in each other's company. It was, Harriet thought, one of the stranger evenings she had spent in a long time. It was also one of the better ones. Adelaide Ashwell was 40, precise, dry-humored, and possessed of the quality of someone who had worked out exactly what she thought about something and was not currently sharing it. She was pleasant to Harriet without performing warmth at her, which Harriet found considerably more comfortable than warmth would have been. She had brought her dog, a terrier named Pemberton, who was also precise and was not pleasant to anyone. "My husband tells me you opened a cabinet lock in 11 seconds, Adelaide said, somewhere in the second course. "The lock was familiar to me," Harriet said. "He times things," Adelaide said, not unkindly. "He timed the walk from the house to his club for 3 months before deciding whether the route was efficient. And was it? It was not. He now goes a different way. It was a small thing." Harriet looked at the Duke, who was listening to something Mr. Peel was saying with the expression of a man who has also heard this story and finds it accurate rather than flattering. He caught her looking. Something moved between them, the brief acknowledgement of two people who have understood something about a third person at the same moment. She looked away. She ate her soup. The proceedings were initiated in May. They were not, as Mr. Peel had warned, resolved quickly. Aldous Grieve had solicitors who were experienced at delay. There were 3 hearings over 8 months, each one producing something that was progress, but not resolution, each one requiring Harriet to be in London rather than Edinburgh for the duration. She stayed in her rented room. She continued her translation work. She wrote to her contacts in Montreal about a position that was becoming available in the autumn, a correspondence school for women, adult literacy, something she had thought about in the abstract, and was beginning to think about in the particular. She saw the Duke on the days when the proceedings required it, and occasionally on days when they didn't. This was partly the necessities of the legal situation, and partly something else that she was careful not to examine. She was careful about it because he was a married man, and she was a woman with a legal case in progress, and both of these things were real, and clarity was, she had found, a habit that required maintenance. But they talked in the way that people talk when they have been in something together that was not ordinary, when they have stood in a study at 11 o'clock at night looking at a document that changed things, when they have asked each other real questions and received real answers. They talked about Canada and India and what it was like to be somewhere that was not where you were from, and to discover that you were, in certain respects, more yourself there than you had been at home. They talked about her father, who he had come to know through the correspondence in the cabinet, through the household accounts, through the shape of a life in a house. He had liked him, he said simply. He had read his letters without meaning to, and had been sorry for what had been done to him. She believed him. This mattered to her more than she had expected. The judgment came down in December. It was specific and careful and did not overturn the original transfer of the estate, which Mr. Peel had warned her not to expect. What it did was set aside the deed of arrangement as improperly executed, order the return of the specific correspondence her father had held in the cabinet, including her mother's letters, and find that Aldous Grieve had misrepresented material facts in the original proceedings. Grieve's solicitors appealed. Mr. Peel was unsurprised and had prepared for this. The appeal was resolved in March, in Harriet's favor, in terms that were less satisfying and more practical than she had imagined in her smaller moments, and more complete than she had permitted herself to hope for in her larger ones. Her father's name was cleared. The documentation of what Grieve had done was on record. The correspondence was returned. She received her mother's letters on a Thursday afternoon. They were bundled in the same way her father had always bundled correspondence, by year and then by sender, careful and methodical and specific. She sat in her rented room and held them, and read two and could not read more that day. She read the rest over the following week, 1 or 2 in the evening, in the window with the last of the light. Her mother had been, she was reminded in each letter, a person with a great deal to say about a great many things, most of them roses, some of them politics, and all of them worth reading. She wrote to the correspondence school in Montreal. She accepted the position. She wrote to Mr. Farley to thank him. He replied with characteristic precision that the thanks were unnecessary and the fee was sufficient. She wrote to Mrs. Fenwick to thank her as well. Mrs. Fenwick replied warmly and mentioned that the East linen cupboard had not been organized as efficiently since Mary Hartley had left. She wrote to Adelaide Ashwell, whom she had seen 6 more times over the preceding months, and had come to find, in the specific way you find people you did not expect to find, genuinely good company. Adelaide replied with an invitation to luncheon before she left for Montreal. Harriet accepted. The Duke brought the letters to her rented room himself. He did not have to. He could have sent them through Mr. Farley, but he brought them in a box she recognized from her father's study, the same box, lined in green, and he set it on the table and did not say anything unnecessary about it. She thanked him. He said it was the least that could be done. She looked at him across the table in her small room with the Edinburgh translations on the desk, and the Montreal letter in the drawer, and her mother's 2 letters she had already read sitting on the windowsill, and she thought about all the things that were true, which were several and not simple, and she said, "You could have made this very much harder." "Yes," he said, "you chose not to." "I looked at the portrait," he said, "in November, in the box room." A pause. "And then I went and looked at you in the linen corridor and thought about what it had taken to come back here." He was quiet for a moment. "It seemed to me that someone should make it easier." Harriet looked at him for a long time. She thought about the orchard in the garden, which had been her father's garden, which had her mother's roses until they were taken out, which was not hers and would not be. She thought about Montreal, about the correspondence school, about adult literacy and women who had not been given the chance to be literate when it was available. She thought about what it meant to build something that was yours in the full sense, not restored, not returned, built. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He nodded. He picked up his hat from the chair where he had set it. He was leaving. This was the end of the matter, or the end of this chapter of it, the part they had been in together. She was going to Montreal. He was going back to the house that was his, where Adelaide was, where the garden was growing something that was not her mother's roses and was none the less a garden. At the door he paused. "The rose beds," he said, "along the east wall. I've asked the gardener to put them back, the original arrangement." A pause. Adelaide agreed it was the right thing. Harriet stood in her rented room with the green-lined box on the table. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he said. "It was just the right thing." He left. She heard his steps on the stairs, on the street, and then nothing. She sat down at the table. She put her hands on the box. She thought about her mother, who had loved those roses, who had spent 10 years getting them exactly right, who had written 7 letters from Canada describing the specific roses she planned to buy when she came home. She thought about the correspondence school in Montreal, about the women who would come to it with the particular kind of courage that comes from deciding, later than you would have chosen, that you are allowed to know things. She thought about what it meant to be allowed to know things. Then she opened the box and took out the letters, and began, carefully and without hurry, to read.